Hey friends, my name is Marty Scolvin Jr., and this is the Marty Party.
It's a Marty Party.
All right, today we're going to be talking about Iran and Greenland again. If you listen to the last episode, we talked a bit about that. Some things have changed. We're going to expand a little bit more on that front. And then we're going to talk about a movie I watched with my daughter this week. It's not a new one, but it's my culture piece for the week. And I want to talk about some life stuff, a little bit of get out of your comfort zone, motivation, what I do, what I plan to do, all of that. All that being said, let's get this party started. Jumping right into Iran. Okay. I want to talk a little bit about here the post-World War II history of Iran. I think it has a lot to do with what we're seeing today. And if you don't have that context, if you don't have that history, this is a good thing to have in the back of your head as you see world events unfold. I've got some robust notes here because I am not an expert on Iran and their history or some of the things that we talk about on here. So I'll be doing a lot of note reading here, but to kind of get you brought up to speed, during World War II, Allied forces actually occupied Iran. I did not know that. I didn't realize Iran was occupied during World War II. Just didn't know that. But during that time, forced Reza Shah out, and his son Mohammad Reza Pahlavi took over. After the war, Iran became a Cold War pressure point as foreign powers competed over influence and oil, much as it is today, influence and oil. We go up to the early 50s, from 1951 to 1953. Iran nationalized oil under Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. Give me a little bit of grace on that one. Not Persian. Don't speak Farsi. Don't know how to pronounce Farsi names. In 1953, a U.S. and UK-backed coup removed him and strengthened the Shah. This is still central to why many Iranians view U.S. policy as regime first, democracy second. We do have a little bit of a checkered past with backing the wrong guy. This is on that list. Then we speed up to the 60s. In 1963, we have the White Revolution. Maybe you've heard about that before. This is something that was big news at the time. The Shah's modernization push deepened social divides. The economic change and political repression mixed with the religious backlash set conditions for 1979. And that was a big flashpoint. Of course, you've heard about the Iranian hostage crisis and the Iranian hostage rescue attempt, Operation Eagle Claw. That was a spicy one, and it kind of ended in, Operation Eagle Claw was a disaster for the U.S.-led effort to rescue, but and it was a bunch of college students and people like that. But the CIA did pull off a successful rescue of some people in there. If you've never seen the movie Argo, I think it's fantastic and kind of goes into some of those efforts back then. Feels like a really relevant movie to maybe go watch or rewatch right now. But during that time, the monarchy fell in Iran, and then the Islamic Republic was formed. And this is what is there to this day. U.S. and Iran relations cratered, and, they've never recovered since, right? During the 80s, there was the Iran and Iraq war, and, that was a big war over there. And, basically they had a generation forged in wartime nationalism and trauma, basically. The state and security apparatus, including the IRGC, became even more central to how things ran in the country. It gave through that process, the Ayatollah gained a lot of power and influence, even more than what he started off with. In the 2000s, this is when we start getting into Iran's nuclear era and a lot of sanctions happening. The Iran's nuclear program became the main axis of Western policy, and it culminated in some things in 2015, some agreements, but it later unraveled. Inside Iran, there was repeated protest waves showing the gap between the public and clerical rule. Again, this is something that I want to continue to highlight. The Iranian people, Persians, largely do not support the Ayatollah and the Islamic Republic. There's a significant minority that does, but most of the country, it does not want anything to do with that. And that's, again, that kind of plays up into the current protests and that we're seeing right now. And then in 2009, this was the revolution that's happening right now. We think it's a revolution, these mass protests and fighting. It is the biggest and possibly bigger than the Green Revolution the Green Movement in 2009. That established a clear pattern, though, that Iranians would protest, the government would crack down, and then there'd be tighter information control. This matters because the regime has spent years building the machinery to shut the internet and isolate dissent. You've seen that with the recent protests, and we'll get into that more, but shutting the internet down, silencing people, intimidating, killing as necessary to try to stomp out anybody that dares stand up to the Ayatollah and his cronies. Now, specifically with the U.S. and Iran relations, I want to kind of focus on what about the past 20, 25 years, basically since 9/11. Well, there was a lot of spillover with Iran into Iraq and Afghanistan during our wars in that. Iran and the U.S., of course, weren't formally at war, but Iran-backed networks and proxy dynamics became a constant factor around the U.S. deployments, especially in Iraq. Again, I think I talked about on the last episode, I was actually part of a task force that its sole intent was to counter Iranian initiatives, movements, sponsors of terror, militias, all of that within Iraq. And they were not, that was at the direction of Soleimani, their guy that was in charge of the IRGC, and a lot of the tomfoolery around the Middle East that Iran does, it was at his hands. And Iran's responsible. They've got a lot of blood, American blood, on their hands. Again, last time we talked about the copper-plated EFPs and all that stuff. I won't go into all of that again, but Iran has done a lot of damage to the U.S. over the years in taking our sons and daughters from us, spilling blood, aiding our enemies, that sort of thing. After Iraq sort of wound down around 2010 to 2011, this is when the proxy attacks really started to step up. U.S. forces and our partners in the region have faced repeated militia attacks from Iran. Washington, periodically retaliates. We'll bomb a site here. We'll try to send a message. Things will quiet down for a little bit, and then they pick back up again. It's been a repeated cycle, right? Without going into open, boots on the ground war with Iran. In 2019 and into 20, towards the end of President Trump's first term, things really escalated. There were a lot of rocket and drone attacks, and our answer to that was basically to smoke Qasem Soleimani, who is the commander of the Quds Force and the IRGC. And, Iran retaliated to that. By the way, Soleimani, he was smoked, taken out right outside Baghdad International Airport. I've actually driven by. There's a memorial to him there, which kind of pisses me off a little bit. But I've driven right by it before. I mean, it was right outside the airport. And there's nothing but a burnt wreckage of a car there now. And anyways, Iran retaliated for that with some ballistic missiles targeted at different U.S. sites. There were injuries from that, mostly TBIs and things like that. But I'm not downplaying those injuries. There's a lot of soldiers that, had to endure those attacks. And although they didn't lose their life, they will probably have lifelong issues because of that. Anybody that's experienced, most people will never experience that level of violence, a ballistic missile going off. That's not a common experience. And then, for the veterans out there and the people that have, taken rocket attacks or mortar attacks overseas, still, I promise you that is nothing compared to a ballistic missile barrage. Nothing. The overpressure, everything is just cranked up to 100. So, yeah, but that's where kind of things ended there. And then now with Trump back in office again and us trying to escalate pressure on them. I mean, we recently bombed one of their nuclear sites, which I don't think they were super happy about. And the U.S. military is continuing to say that they're weighing options, including military options, and as unrest in Iran escalates, and the engagements that we might engage in could range anything from kinetic attacks from either drones or fixed wing piloted aircraft, anything like that, cyber attacks, sanctions. We've already got a lot of sanctions on them, but increased sanctions and information operations. This will probably, it's not going to be just one of these things. There's probably all sorts of these things already going on. So that kind of brings us up into current day, right? And certainly if you've been on social media, you've probably seen footage of the protests that have just taken over Iran. You've probably heard about Iran's retaliation and the Ayatollah's crackdown that he's trying to institute right now and taking out the internet. But if you're not completely caught up, these protests started on December 28th. They didn't happen just last week, even if that's when it showed up in your social media feed. They've been going on since December 28th. And it originally started over economic conditions and quickly escalated into anti-regime, broader anti-regime demonstrations and a call for the end of clerical rule. Now, right now, as of the current numbers that I have, there's a couple of different groups that are saying that there's been around 3,000 protesters killed and over 22,000 arrests. It's really hard to verify these numbers, so take them with a grain of salt. But I feel pretty comfortable saying that the number of deaths are in the thousands and the number of arrests are in the tens of thousands. I think it's very safe to say. There's been an internet blackout that started on January 8th, and this is so that these crimes against Iran's own people can't be broadcast to the world. And that's only been working so much because now we've got, I guess, some Starlink satellites over there giving internet back to certain people in Iran. Certain parts of the population are getting access again because of the Starlink satellites. The Ayatollah wants to permanently not deal with this, though. Assuming the Ayatollah and the Iranian, the Islamic Republic survive this, they have talked about maybe setting up an intranet within the country that's closed off to the rest of the world. Some of the things that they're throwing around sound very North Korea-ish. To give you a little bit of context there, these clandestine Starlink terminals, though, are one way for us to help the people over there while this is going on, though. And authorities are criminalizing and hunting down the satellite internet users. So it's kind of a use at your own risk sort of thing. Now, what are we going to do about it? President Trump has said that, quote, all options are on the table. Apparently, he initially said that if they start killing protesters, we're going to intervene, not necessarily with boots on the ground, but I assume, sending in some fighter jets and bombers and things like that to help out, among other things. Like I said, thousands have been killed and we haven't done anything like that yet. And apparently the latest thing that I saw from the president was that they were planning to hang 800 protesters publicly the other day, and they backed off of that. So he backed off a little bit. But I think that they're still continuing to evaluate when and how they might help out the people, because it's very much in the U.S.'s interest to have the Islamic Republic overturned. The White House's language, they continue to say grave consequences and things like that. High-level briefings that are going on right now, I assume it's hard to predict what's going to happen, and I find myself a little bit conflicted on how involved we should be. But in the meantime, while they're evaluating, remember, it's not just as simple as start dropping bombs. We also have to consider retaliation in the region. We have a lot of American troops and American citizens in that region that are within striking distance of Iran. So we have to make sure we have our ducks in a row from a security perspective for everybody stationed in that region before we start really shoving a stick into the hornet's nest over there. And some of those movements have already started to happen. There's been withdrawals of U.S. troops from key Middle Eastern bases, and some different movements that have been going on. There's been Navy and Air Force movements toward the region, and I'm sure CENTCOM is busy right now putting plans together if and should the president decide to strike. And I think that planning doesn't necessarily mean that there's an imminent invasion, and evacuation doesn't mean that there's an imminent strike. But I think that they're, like they said, keeping all options on the table, and they're prepared to exercise any and all options. Like I said, I feel a little bit conflicted here on how I feel about this. I am vehemently in support of the Iranian people. I think it would be wonderful if the Islamic Republic were overturned and the Ayatollah was removed from power. That regime is responsible for so much evil, so much bad in this world. It would be a good day for humanity for that to happen. But I'm very wary of how involved we get into more Middle Eastern conflicts or conflicts in general. Now, I'm very much in a sort of, well, let's just see how this plays out. Let's see what happens, and regardless of what decision that they make. And I don't think that, again, that anybody is considering putting actual troops, like conventional troops, on the ground to start doing patrols and things like that inside Iran. I don't think that's a part of the strategy. But if we can help turn the tide in the protesters and the people's favor over there with taking out ammunition depots and things like that, taking out some of their equipment and infrastructure that supports the military in the Islamic Republic, that's probably worth it. So I'm just kind of in a wait and see how this turns out. If you'd asked me before we intervened in Venezuela the way that we did, if I was going to support, they'd be like, no, I don't want to get into another forever war. But, that turned out pretty well. Took out Maduro, and we're not, we don't have troops stuck in the jungle right now fighting for their lives. Like, that's okay. That turned out pretty well. All's well that ends well. So we'll see how this goes in Iran, and as far as how involved we get, when, if, all that sort of stuff, we'll see. I'm going to keep an eye on it, and I'm skeptical, but I hope for the best, and I hope that the people of Iran can pull this off. If they do, what does that mean for the world, right? Like, what are the ramifications of an Iranian revolution that takes the Islamic Republic out of power? Like, what does that look like? Well, I think that we can look at this in sort of three different layers, right? There's what happens internally in Iran. There's what happens in the region, the Middle East region. And then there's how does this impact like global systems and global politics? So starting with what happens inside Iran if the Ayatollah isn't there tomorrow, well, we have to look at a transfer of power, what that looks like. Is there a plan? Just because you remove the supreme leader doesn't automatically mean there's going to be a liberal democracy in place the next day, right? Like, that's just not how it works. There's some key questions around whether power will shift to a coalition of foreign nations that I'm sure the U.S. would be involved in, whether it gets moved to sort of a IRGC military-led security state, or a transition to civilian government. But that, for that to happen, there needs to be elections and things like that, and the elections need to be legit. So it's not something that, hey, we remove the Ayatollah and everything is nothing but flowers and rainbows the next day. It's, hey, okay, we removed the Ayatollah, the Islamic Republic fell. That's great. Now we have a power vacuum that we have to worry about. And that's, we'll have to keep an eye on that. Information control is going to become a really big deal within Iran, as far as getting accurate information out, the people having freedom of speech, that sort of thing. And by freedom of speech, I don't mean in a constitutional manner. I mean freedom of movement, almost like the ability to communicate, not just with each other, but to the outside world. It's very possible that any sort of temporary power there might push for digital isolation, and that would not be great. So we got to worry about that. As far as the wider region, the proxy networks that Iran has been supporting for decades now at this point, they very well could lash out. We might have a very serious security situation on our hands if those different proxy networks and militias decide to just go start attacking the nearest anything in light of Iran falling. So we got to worry about that. If there's a leadership crisis in Iran from the removal of the government, then there's less centralized control, which means it's harder for us to keep tabs on what all of these different groups are doing and what they're up to. I'm sure we can do a little bit of de-escalation via capturing funds. We already do that on a regular basis, but I'm sure we'd definitely step up those efforts in light of that. And the U.S. has to plan around bases and partners being targeted during all of that transition chaos. So a few things to keep in mind there, especially as it pertains to America. There's also, the whole nuclear situation would be a big unknown moving forward there. Think about all the nuclear situations that arose after the Soviet Union fell in the Eastern Bloc, and it's like, hey, so what's going to happen with these nuclear facilities? I would have to assume that that's something that the international community is going to immediately need to take control of. In a chaotic transition like that, though, there's command and control and nuclear decision making becomes this wildly sort of unpredictable variable as a revolution or a coup. Any of those sorts of things are in progress. This is why Washington treats instability in Tehran as a security issue, not just a human rights story. So we have to keep that in mind. Does Iran have the ability to strike the U.S. with a nuke from where they're at? No, but man, they can cause a lot of problems in the region, and they can cause a lot of problems. And then, as far as the global impact, I would say that the nuclear risk, is not just a regional threat, but a global threat. But getting into more specific global economic and geopolitical impacts, we have to think about the oil and shipping volatility that would arise from this. Any major instability in Iran tends to spike uncertainty around Gulf shipping and energy markets. So even good news, like the Ayatollah falling and the Islamic Republic falling, good news like that can still create political short-term and economic risk. And you can directly tie this to like everyday American costs. There's a ripple effect. Even if we're not actively buying Iranian oil, there's a ripple effect. Now, certainly the oil we just seized in Venezuela will help with that. Again, why is Venezuela important? Well, things going on in Iran, like all of this ties together. And then there's sort of the domestic stakes within the U.S. The U.S. is juggling rhetoric around, hey, all options are on the table, with risk to personnel in the region and alliance pressures. The Washington Post describes allies urging restraint and concerns about retaliation against U.S. troops and partners. I think a lot of these allies are getting some oil and other stuff from Iran, just like when France was super against us invading Iraq, which, by the way, was the right stance. But, hey, why were they so against us invading Iraq? Was it for some altruistic reason? No, France was doing business with Saddam Hussein under the table. So, we always got to take with a grain of salt when the international community doesn't want us to do something. Sometimes there's some underlying reasons. That should hopefully get you caught up on everything Iran. This isn't necessarily just like some foreign policy show or whatever. I want to do a news segment every week and cover some of these topics, narrow it down to the things that I'm super interested in. I'm not necessarily breaking news here or anything. If you've been following the situation closely, if you've been following Iran for years, I didn't tell you anything new here. But I know a lot of people, they want just a quick catch up on things. And I've got a little bit of experience in the region and know a few different Iranians, and actually went to high school with a guy from Iran who was over here on a, I don't know if it was like a student visa or something, but somebody else that I went to school with could probably tell you more about that. I wasn't super close friends with him, but yeah, I know quite a different people and have been exposed to it. I've gone up into the Barzani Mountains up in Iraq there, northeastern Iraq in the Kurdish area, and had tea and coffee with Kurdish Iranians, and they really described what life is like inside Iran, especially for Kurds, and it's really interesting stuff. Like I said, I just really hope that the people can pull this off. I hope that freedom and a shot at democracy, representative democracy, is on the table for them. And I hope they're able to do it without too much bloodshed. There's already blood being shed, but hopefully it's able to be minimized. That's the thing about revolutions, though. Governments, especially authoritarian governments, don't give up power easily, right? Like, they're not going to just hand this thing over because they've got a little bit of pressure. They're going to thrash out and do everything that they can to hold on to that power. So, for the people fighting this fight, my heart's out there to you. I'm pulling for you. I hope the U.S. does support in some way or another. I mean, and trust me, do we have somebody over there right now, a few people doing things on the down low? I guarantee it. And also, do you think that the U.S. was not maybe fanning the flames of this protest in any way that we could? For sure. Just think about 2020 when we had the George Floyd and all of the aftermath of that, all those protests around the country. They didn't happen because, foreign governments were in meddling. They didn't happen. But if you don't think that China and Russia and our other adversaries didn't have people in there just kind of poking these crowds and getting them to be as volatile as they could be, if they weren't fanning the flames from the sidelines, I think you're very gullible if you don't think that was going on. And it's the same thing here. You're very gullible if you don't think that the U.S. and possibly others are in there fanning the flames and doing whatever they can to keep this thing going and give the people hope and all of that. So I hope they can pull it off. I don't remember the exact quote off the top of my head, but I think it's something to the effect of from one of the founding fathers, the tree of liberty from time to time has to be watered with blood. And yeah, if you want liberty, it usually costs blood. I hope they come out of this okay. Let's move over to Greenland. I'm slightly less positive about what's going on over there. I'm rooting for us on Iran, Greenland. I am a little bit concerned about everything that I'm seeing lately. President Trump is definitely being aggressive, him and his administration, about their push for control of Greenland. President Trump has publicly demanded that Denmark transfer control of Greenland to the United States. He's framed it as critical to U.S. national security and defense strategy. I don't necessarily think that he's wrong about that, by the way. He said anything less than U.S. control is, quote, unacceptable. So that's one thing. We have to remember Greenland is a sovereign territory. It's under the Kingdom of Denmark. It's a part of the European Union. There's a lot of different people that aren't just, again, they're not just going to hand this thing over just because the U.S. says we want it. So this is kind of pitting us against our own allies here over this. To the extent that Trump announced that there would be a 10% tariff on imports from 8 different European countries that have been taking part in a military exercise. Those 8 countries are Denmark, Norway, Sweden, France, Germany, the United Kingdom, Netherlands, and Finland. And that's set to begin on February 1st, so a couple weeks here. And then those tariffs will rise to 25% by June unless Denmark agrees to sell Greenland. European leaders have sharply condemned the move, as one might expect them to do. Denmark and Greenland have refused a U.S. takeover. Greenland's prime minister firmly chose Denmark and NATO over the U.S. and has rejected U.S. acquisition attempts and reaffirmed their sovereignty. So the people of Greenland are not, saying, yeah, actually, we want to be a part of the United States. They're pretty happy with their current situation. They want to keep status quo. There's a European military operation underway right now, similar to how we do operations in like the South China Sea and places like that to, flex our military power against China and, make sure people are staying on their toes. This is basically what Europe's doing right now, as the U.S. has, said that they're not, they're not saying that we're going to take military options off the table with Greenland, which is insane to me. But this U.S. military, or sorry, this European military operation is called Operation Arctic Endurance. Several European and NATO allies have deployed troops to Greenland in a Danish-led exercise to demonstrate unified defense of the territory and try to deter unilateral U.S. action. It's prudent to note that, again, these are NATO allies, most of which their military has fought side by side with the American military throughout the War on Terror. For example, Danish troops have deployed to both Iraq and Afghanistan. UK troops they've lost lives of their service members in Iraq and Afghanistan. Like, these are our closest allies in the world. And right now they are worried about getting into a fight with the U.S., a military fight. Crazy. The European Union leadership is obviously condemning the U.S. European Union leaders, including Ursula von der Leyen, have warned that tariffs and coercive tactics could trigger a dangerous downward spiral in transatlantic relations and harm cooperation on broader security issues like Ukraine. That's an important one. If you don't think Putin is watching this right now and seeing fractures in the NATO relationships, if you don't think that he is not just salivating at the idea of NATO breaking up, I got another thing for you. So there's a lot of ripple effect, downstream implications here with what's going on. European Parliament backed Denmark's sovereignty. The EU Parliament has passed a statement condemning any attempt to undermine Denmark's territorial integrity and insists that decisions about Greenland's future must be made by Denmark and Greenland alone. They're not mincing words there. And Russia has publicly commented, speaking of Putin, Russia has publicly commented on the dispute, highlighting unpredictability in the NATO alliance as European troops arrive in Greenland for security exercises amid the standoff. Again, Putin is salivating at this. He hopes that this continues to escalate between the U.S. and the European Union. Why is this happening? I've said before, I don't think that Trump or the administration is wrong for saying that Greenland is strategically important and that they want to acquire it. I don't think that the desire to acquire it is wrong. I think that the way that they're going about it and risking our friendships and our allies in very important places is dangerous. I think we need to, quit rattling sabers and just worry about, like, hey, what kind of offer do we need to make to buy this thing? And if that doesn't work out, be willing to just walk away and say, okay, we tried. So I understand the desire. And why is there a desire there to get it, right? Greenland is geopolitically huge. Its location in the Arctic is strategically vital for missile defense. You've heard Trump recently talk about the Golden Dome that they're trying to build and how Greenland is vital to that. Its early warning systems and control of Arctic sea lanes. The U.S. has already operated from Pitufik Space Base under Danish consent, and some Pentagon analysts argue direct control would remove political constraints. So again, if anybody thinks that we don't currently have a U.S. military presence on Greenland, that's incorrect. We do have a presence there, and we have since shortly after World War II. This is threatening, like I said, NATO cohesion. European governments see any U.S. attempt to unilaterally seize or pressure for territory as a violation of NATO principles and could potentially trigger an Article 5 incursion if this does become a military thing. And I will remind you that Article 5 basically says an attack on one is an attack on all in the alliance. So if we attack a NATO country, to include Greenland, which is a part of Denmark, then that would invoke Article 5, and now we're fighting the entire European Union. Some of you may feel completely comfortable with that. What I'll remind you is it's not can we beat the European Union or not. It's what will our bigger adversaries, our pre-existing adversaries like China and Russia, what will they be doing while we're vulnerable fighting the European Union? That's not a good situation to be in. Greenlanders themselves want self-determination. Local leaders emphasize independence from both Denmark and the U.S. with a strong push for self-rule, a dimension often overlooked but critical to understanding internal dynamics. So Greenlanders, again, it's a small country, not a lot of people there, but they have a say in this. I don't think that the people there probably feel great about being the ping pong ball going back and forth between the United States and Denmark or the European Union. So I'm sure they have a take on this. And this is concerning. So we are materially damaging friendships and allies, our relationship with allies over this. And then we've got one of our neighbors. You know, when we talk about trying to take care of the home front, make sure the home front, the Western Hemisphere, is secure. Well, Canada just the other day courted China and came together to slash key tariffs and reset economic relations with China after years of tension. Prime Minister Mark Carney announced a deal in Beijing that cuts Canada's 100% tariff on Chinese electric vehicles to a 6.1% rate on up to 49,000 electric vehicles annually, and secures China's commitment to reduce tariffs on major Canadian agricultural exports, including canola seeds, which will drop from 85% to about 15% tariff, lobsters, peas, crabs, all beginning on March 1st, 2026. The agreement is framed as a strategic move to diversify Canada's trade beyond its heavy U.S. reliance and unlock roughly $3 billion in export opportunities. This also includes commitments on investments and the cooperation in energy and clean technology. So, said simply, Canada is saying, all right, you, America, if you want to just fuck around and treat us like we're yesterday's news, then we're going to go make friends with China. We're going to go where we're valued. So they think. Now, am I concerned that we're pissing off our neighbor to the north, Canada, like this? Yes. Do I think Canada is very short-sighted on making a deal with the devil just to slight us? Also, yes. Canada, China's not out to be your friend. Just because they're acting friendly right now doesn't mean they're not going to try to hollow you out from the inside, just like termites. They will do anything that they can to shore up. And the way China sees this is a way to take something away from the U.S., just like the U.S. took Venezuela away from China, right? So there's a very interesting tit for tat going on within the international community right now. There's chess moves being made. We make one move that's like, oh, that was a good move. Somebody else makes another move to counter it, right? Or to affect different outcomes. So we need to keep an eye on that. What I'm concerned about is that we are taking an approach that could be described as embracing isolationism. And we've done that before. Notably, we did that after World War I. The U.S. rejected the Treaty of Versailles and never joined the League of Nations back then. We then leaned into the stay out of it politics in the 1930s with the Neutrality Acts and, kind of taking that Switzerland sort of approach. And that was all meant to keep America from getting dragged into another European war. Well, and again, I don't necessarily blame them back then for saying, hey, we just went over to World War I and we lost a lot of people in a very short amount of time. And that was horrific. Mustard gas, trenches. I mean, fucking horrific stuff. And, the American Expeditionary Force that went over there, all heroes. And I don't blame America for saying, hey, maybe we'll just worry about ourselves after that, because we were a young nation still. Remember, we were only at the time of World War I about 120 years old, right? Like very, very young nation still. And so we thought that isolationism was the best way to look out for America's interests and keep Americans safe. Well, that worked for a little bit, I guess, but it didn't stop global conflict. It reduced our American leverage on the world and treated aggressors and victims too similarly, and left the country reacting late to rapidly worsening threats. And it all came to a head when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor and drug us into the war anyway. Now we're playing catch up because we isolated. Now we got to play catch up. And boy, did they, right? The American manufacturing base, the American men and women, they rallied to the call, the Japanese made a big mistake attacking, and it was just in time. The Japanese did Europe a favor by attacking us. The folly, when we think about this, right, about isolationism, isn't that America shouldn't avoid unnecessary wars. Again, I'm not shy about saying military action should be a last resort in any situation. But we have to consider that it's pretending we can wall ourselves off from the world, which is a very interconnected security and economic system at this point. And those shocks can hand the leverage to hostile actors like Russia and China. They'll shrink our choices. Other countries will be able to force our hand more easily and force harder decisions under worse conditions. And also isolationism. We're a part of the global economy. There's things that we can't get from elsewhere that we don't have here in America. And we have to consider that. And we have to consider, well, part of the reason we've been able to keep the enemy off our shores for so long and it's so hard to attack America is because we've had solid friends from both the North and the South. Now, obviously, Mexico has not been the greatest partner at times with some of the border issues that we've had and some of their leaders turning a blind eye to that and to cartels and things like that, of course. But, you're going to have to fight across Mexico to get to America, and you're going to have to fight across Canada to get from the north side, and good luck just directly attacking America. If we're losing friends, we're talking about military action in Mexico too, by the way, or it's been suggested. And then now we're pissing off Canadians. We got to be careful. We got to think about the long-term effects and the second and third order effects here. So, I hope that there's a strategy here, and I hope this all turns out okay. But I'd be lying if I said that I wasn't concerned about this sort of move towards isolationism and then what's going on between us and Canada and us and the European Union. That's all I've got for news. Before we get into culture, you'll notice I am wearing my glasses today. You will rarely see me in those, but I feel like I need to say something about it. One, because I'm extremely self-conscious about them. I hate glasses. I almost always wear contacts. The only time I ever put glasses on is if randomly I've gotten eye infections over the years. And of course, I need to take my contacts out for that and put glasses on. Or when my supply of contacts runs out and I can't just order new ones because the prescription ran out. Now I got to go make another eye appointment to get the prescription for the contacts, even though my contact prescription hasn't changed in 15 fucking years. A little bit of frustrated about that, yes. But it is what it is. So I'm wearing glasses until I make an eye appointment, go in, get that done, hopefully get a loaner pair of contacts while I'm in there. They usually do that, and then get the new ones in. But until then, I'm looking through tuna cans here, which sucks. So yeah, that's my piece on that. On culture, let's get away from the serious stuff in the news into some culture. Nothing crazy on culture this week. I know they had an award show for Hollywood the other week, and a little bit of coffee here. 1 second. And as I'm recording this, the Bills and the Broncos are playing, by the way, on culture. Last time I looked, it was 24-23 with like 7 minutes left in the fourth. So I am anxiously awaiting to wrap up this Marty Party and see who pulled that out. I love the Broncos team, but I would be lying if I said I wasn't pulling for Josh Allen and the Bills. The Bills, like the Vikings, have never won a Super Bowl. I used to live in central New York for a while, so I got a soft spot in my heart. I'm a Vikings fan, but I got a soft spot for the Bills. So I hope they pull this one out. But I want to talk about, we do a family movie night every once in a while, with my daughters and my wife. And this week, my oldest daughter wanted to watch Aquaman. Now, when she was really little, she had like a crush on, she'll probably kill me for saying this on here, but she had a crush on Jason Momoa. Not Jason Momoa specifically, she had a crush on Aquaman. And now she's a competitive swimmer. She's on a year-round swim club and doing fantastic, improving every week. So yeah, she's got a vested interest in all things to do with the water. And specifically, her team name has to do with like, sea creatures in Greek mythology and all that sort of stuff. So, something like Aquaman and Atlantis and all of that is like very interesting to her. So we watched that. I've seen it before. But watching it again there's things that I like about the movie, and then a lot of things where I'm like, gosh, that could have been done a little bit better. There's a few corny lines in there. There's a few things that I just wish would have been done differently. Like at the very end there, I'm not going to worry about spoilers on this one. This movie's been out for years. But like at the very end, when Aquaman's mom, the queen, comes out of the water to anoint him to be the king of Atlantis and all of that, and she's like, dude, there's this big battle that just happened, fighting for their lives, and then she shows up in like this like glittery 70s like style dress. It was a really weird choice. I don't know why they didn't just have her in her like combat uniform, for lack of a better description, that she wore for the majority of the movie. That just little weird choices like that. And then there was sort of two antagonists. You've got Manta, the human like former Navy SEAL, who Aquaman killed his dad, and so he's now got his hands on some technology from the Atlanteans to try to go after Aquaman. But then you've got the other antagonist in the Aquaman's stepbrother, who is trying to be the king. And so I just felt like that aspect of it was a little bit busy. I wish they would have focused on one or the other. Maybe that would have resulted in a much simpler movie, but like two different antagonists on each front, I don't know. I just didn't love that. I thought that there was a better way to go about that, but I like Jason Momoa as an actor. I think he played a hell of an Aquaman. Some of the graphics are really cool. There's a lot to like about the movie, but it's one of those experiences that watching it again with my daughter reminded me of why I haven't watched it again over the years. And by the way, I should say, just as context, I'm a big superhero movie fan. I've loved them since I was a kid. I go to the Marvel movies, I go to all the Batman movies, all that, Deadpool. I love it all. I used to love the X-Men movies, even though those movies are not that good either. Many of them. I loved Logan though. That was fucking amazing. But yeah, I hold both Marvel and DC movies to a high standard because I love them so much. And Aquaman just felt, it felt okay. And I don't know. It did spur this conversation though, of now that my oldest daughter's old enough, we were talking about going back and watching all the MCU Marvel movies from the beginning. By the way, I'm not saying Aquaman is Marvel. It's not. But I'm just saying that watching that movie reminded us, hey, we should go start from the beginning and watch all the MCU movies from Marvel over the years, like all in order, make it this whole thing. So I'm kind of excited about that. We'll see if we can get that going. But yeah, I don't know. It's cool to go watch an old movie or a movie you haven't seen in a while again, especially sharing those moments with your kids. The next one up that I do want to watch is I listened to this interview the other day on a podcast with the woman that the movie Swimmers is about. She's an Olympic swimmer who was a Syrian refugee and had to escape Syria during the war there. And eventually made it to Germany as a refugee, and then competed on the as an Olympic swimmer years later. Insanely inspiring story. They made a movie about it. It's called The Swimmers, and I haven't watched it yet, but it's definitely high on my list. I want to go watch that. I want to watch it specifically with my daughter because she aspires to go to the Olympics someday, and I think inspiring stories like that are really cool. So. That's the next one on deck that I want to go see. So I don't know if I can get that done in the next week. I'll talk about it on next week's podcast. All right. That's all I'll say on that. Not a big culture section this week, but that brings us to the quote of the week. I found this one looking through some old notes, and it's from Chuck Palahniuk, which you may know as the author behind Fight Club. He's written a lot of books. I have quite a few of them behind me here. He said, "Don't do what you want. Do what you don't want. Do what you're trained not to want. Do the things that scare you the most." So that's from Chuck Palahniuk, and that just really resonates with me. Everything about having discipline, self-discipline, doing the hard thing first, doing the thing that you don't want to do first every day. There's something to be said about that. Because there's everybody in your life, there's that chore that you hate doing, or that social obligation that you have that you hate doing, that thing at work that every time it gets tasked to you, or that maybe is a regular part of your responsibilities, that you're just like, oh, I fucking hate doing this. Or maybe you're somebody that just does not like to work out, does not like to run, or does not like to be outside, that sort of stuff. It's like in almost every situation, doing the thing that you don't want to do is going to be good for you. And that kind of leads me into my sort of, life stuff that I want to talk about this week. And it's all about getting outside of your comfort zone. Now, I've thought for a long time that the key to having success in life is your ability to seamlessly move in and out of your comfort zone, and not flinch every time you move outside of it. And I think about how different my life would be if I'd stayed within my comfort zone, if I'd never left South Dakota to join the Army, if when I joined the Army, I never volunteered to be an airborne ranger, if when I got to airborne school, and I'm not, not deathly afraid, but I am not a big fan of heights. I liked the idea of jumping out of airplanes more than I liked the actual act of jumping out of a moving aircraft in the air. So when it came time to do that, it was wildly outside of my comfort zone. And it didn't help that the first time I ever jumped out of an airplane was out of a C-130 whose troop door is not tall enough for me. So I had to duck on my way out, which is an uncomfortable thing. And just, yeah, it sucked, but I got through it. And that led me to, eventually I go to RIP and make it into the Ranger Regiment. The entire experience of the Ranger Regiment is one of being outside of your comfort zone. At least it was for me. You are challenged every single day. But that experience turned me into the man that I am today. It prepared me for the rest of life, on top of a few things that I experienced as a kid. And I think about going from there into the world, leaving the military was, again, leaving my comfort zone. Because at a certain point, the military, that regular paycheck, knowing you're never going to get fired, all, steady health insurance, all that sort of stuff, it becomes a little bit of a warm blanket. And there's just certain things you don't have to worry about. You're always going to have the holidays off, unless you're deployed. But, you're always going to have the holidays off. You're going to get 4-day weekends. You're going to get all these things that are not common in the civilian world. So leaving the military was leaving the comfort zone, was taking a risk. And then every step of the way from there, I've had to repeatedly take risks. And as I sit here today, where I'm not working for anybody right now, my last job was with Black Rifle Coffee Company. That ended last summer. And I departed from there into the unknown. And, I wasn't looking for another job or anything like that. I decided, no, I need to go step out on my own. So I started the Subject Matter Expert podcast. And then later, at the beginning of this year, I started the Marty Party, which you're listening to right now. I've continued to work on the book that I'm doing, and as well as take on some other freelance writing things here and there to help pay the bills. And it's all been very important, but I'm wildly outside of my comfort zone right now. But I know if I don't keep on this path, I'm not going to get where I want to get in life. I'm not going to get the comfort that I want in life. I'm not going to have the ability to do the things that I have set out to do, and the goals that I have set for myself, the long-term goals. I need to have the autonomy of working for myself. I need to take that risk and trust the process and know that this continuous everyday discomfort will eventually lead me back into the warm embrace of my comfort zone. And, you go back to your comfort zone someday, and then it's time to say, what's next? And you're going to have to leave it again. If you lead a life of constantly pursuing discomfort, of constantly pursuing the things that scare you, but deep down you should be doing and would be good for you, and you're able to just mitigate that risk in your head, the threat of that risk, even if you don't get to where you're hoping to get in life, man, what a life you'll have lived. What a life you will have lived. And I look at every risk that I've taken. If I got hit by a bus tomorrow, I've lived a good life. And it's because I've continuously, time after time, pushed myself outside of my comfort zone. I've done the things that scared me or that I was hesitant about at a minimum. And so I guess I kind of want to have a message today to everybody out there who is holding back from doing that thing, and it's different for everybody, but if you're listening to this right now, I know there's a thing in the back of your head or something, and it's coming to the front of your head as I bring it up right now, that you've been avoiding doing or avoiding making a decision on or avoiding saying, let's fucking go. Go do that thing. Start doing it. Even if you can't do that thing, whatever it is, right away, start taking the steps towards doing that thing. Just start. I don't know what else to tell you. I don't have it all figured out. I don't. I'm learning every day, and as I've gotten older, the only thing that I know is that I don't know everything, but I do know you're never going to regret routinely pushing yourself outside of your comfort zone. I do know that for a fact. So that's what I'll say on that this week. Sorry for the little motivational Tony Robbins speech there, but it's as much for you as it is for me, or it's as much for me as it is for you. Yeah. I promise I know how to talk. Hey, I think this is pretty neat. Check this out. This is, let me get it in the light here. See the little film canisters down here? This camera, this old OD green camera strap here. Let me take this apart. Check that out. Right? It's a Yashica film camera, and it's a Minister D Yashica. This camera is engraved back here with the name, maybe you can see it on there, the name of my uncle. And my uncle gave this to me, my Uncle Randy. And it's one of my most treasured possessions because I am a photographer. I've carried a camera into some of the most dangerous corners of the world. And that up here so that people can see. And my Uncle Randy served 2 tours in Vietnam. He was a diver, helped out naval special warfare, did a lot of crazy things, and he carried this camera for part of his tours in Vietnam. Then he carried it on a lot of other adventures from there, like hiking the entire Continental Divide Trail after he got out. He's lived an incredible life, and this camera had been with him through a lot of that. This is a Japanese camera. I want to say he bought this while he was on leave from one of his tours in Vietnam, like mid-tour leaves or something, R&R, I think they called it back then. And, I was visiting him a couple years ago and saw this, and it caught my eye because, old cameras do catch my eye. And as with everything with him, I figured it had a story behind it, and he told me a little bit about it. And he offered to give it to me. And it kind of took me back. It took me by surprise. And, of course, I accepted after repeatedly asking him if he's sure. And yeah, so I left with it that day, and I just, man, this, these old 35 millimeter canisters on here, just duct taped on. It's so well put together. Excuse me. This bottom piece of the case here is severed from the main thing there. This would typically hang down, but this part is, it wore through, it creased so many times. And so you can't do anything with it now, but the camera still works, of course. These old 35 millimeter, film cameras, they go for a long, long time. And yeah, I just, at some point I'm going to put some film in there and go take a picture with it. But for right now, it pretty much just sits on my shelf with some other valuable possessions. But I don't know if anybody else has anything like that out there, but this is a special one for me. And it's a reminder to me every day that I look at it that most of my photography journey has been with digital cameras. I'd really like to get into using film again. The older that I get, the more I yearn for the old days of analog, and maybe there's a little bit of hipster in me. I don't know. But I want to start shooting with film and see how that goes. And maybe the first shots I take will be on this. So I've got a few other old cameras too, but this one for sure stands out. And I thought it'd be, my little show and tell. I think this is neat section that I do in every show. I thought it'd be kind of cool for that. Figured you guys might appreciate that. But all that being said, thanks for coming to the Marty Party. Join me again next week. If you don't want to miss a single show, make sure you subscribe if you're watching on YouTube, or follow if you are listening or watching on Spotify. And I hope you have a great week. We'll see how everything turns out internationally that we talked about. I'll come with a stronger culture piece next week, and keep watching. Leave a comment below with your thoughts. I've loved some of the comments that I've been getting, and let's just keep it going. Well, see you later.
It's a Marty Party. It's a Marty Party.